asked me to introduce myself, what can one say about oneself? I'll just tell you that I'm a 3-time alum of UCLA. I got my bachelor's degree in history. Then I decided to stick around. Got a master's degree a couple years later in U.S. history and a PhD in U.S. history as well in 2002. Currently, I'm a professor in the Sports, Commerce, and Culture program at the University of Maryland, College Park. The paper I'm going to present today is kind of a divergence from my normal research area. I'm currently working on a book that's going to be called American Politics, Sports, Civil Rights, and the Cold War. And it's about the U.S. government attempts to manipulate international perceptions of American race relations by sending African American athletes and integrated sports teams all over the world, particularly to Africa and Asia. I'm sorry, I don't allow tape recording.
It's from the press.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Nope.
Appreciate it, thank you. Mostly through Africa and Asia, so this is something, Arthur Ashe is someone I've always been fascinated by. And just for those of you who don't know much about Arthur Ashe, let me say a few things about him by way of introduction. Arthur Ashe was the first African-American male to win the U.S. Open, to win Wimbledon, the Australian Open, and he won the men's singles tennis championship while he was a student here at UCLA. Unfortunately, so many of the students here only know Ashe based upon the wellness center on campus named after him. But he was twice ranked the #1 player in the world. But Ashe wasn't the best tennis player of all time. In fact, he wasn't even the best player of his generation. That honor probably belongs to Jimmy Connors. However, because of his influence in tennis, but also outside of tennis, Ashe is often seen as being part of that great pantheon of athletes in American society. And if you're familiar with Ashe, he would always say that he did not want winning Wimbledon to be his culminating moment. And to that end, Ashe was actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, was involved in changing the U.S.'s policies toward Haitian immigrants. He was an activist for AIDS. He was an educator, wrote I don't want to say it's the first, but wrote one of the most significant histories of the black athlete, his 3-volume collection, Hard Road to Glory. But Ashe becomes a prominent figure at a very interesting moment, particularly in the late 1960s. But let me start by telling a story that initially got me interested in Ashe. Oh, let me say something here about this book, $40 Million Slaves. Anyone here heard of this book? It's a book that was just released last fall by William Roden, who is a columnist for the New York Times and a analyst on ESPN. And in this book, he really looks at African American athletes from the standpoint of social engagement. Those of you who are not Michael Jordan fans will find a scathing critique of him in this book. It's one of my favorite chapters. But what Roden is attempting to do is to engage the question of athletes not in terms of their contribution to sports, but their contribution to African American society and the larger world. And so it's thinking about this book, some of his arguments here, that I'm going to try to engage the life of Arthur Ashe and find some kind of meaning for us and engage in this kind of question of what is it that we expect from athletes, in particular African American athletes. Now, the June 8, 1992 issue of People magazine contained a first-person narrative allegedly penned by Arthur Ashe. And in this piece, Ashe is quoted with saying that living with AIDS is not the greatest burden I've had in my life. Being black is. No question about it. The article went on to detail many of his experiences growing up in the segregated South. He had to sit behind the white lines on public transportation. He was banned from tennis tournaments, and he was barred from attending the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And of course, this article caused a firestorm. His provocative words unsettled many who knew him intimately. In fact, his best friend, Donald Dale, was so shocked that he called Ashe in the middle of the night while he was in Hamburg, Germany, to ask if he had been misquoted. Others who found his words troubling wondered, what did he have to complain of? Weren't his fame and wealth enough? Because Ashe was perceived as a respectable victim of AIDS, who had contracted the disease through a blood transfusion after he had a heart attack and subsequently had heart surgery in 1983. The general consensus was that AIDS was more burdensome because of his status as a tragic and unfortunate casualty of the disease. However, this perspective fails to consider that Ashe was also a tragic and unfortunate victim of racism and racially based politics. But if you look at Ashe's fourth autobiography, I saw a copy somewhere over here, you know you've lived a life when you have 4 autobiographies. But the sad reality of Days of Grace is that Ashe didn't live to see its publication. And as you're reading it, you really get this sense that Ashe knew he was about to die. Indeed, in 1992, AIDS was still a death sentence. Like Magic Johnson and many others who recently contracted HIV and are able to live a long life, when Ashe found out that he had AIDS, he knew that his death was imminent. And you get a sense of that through the book. And you also see a freedom, a liberating kind of moment, particularly someone like Arthur Ashe, who was such a private and often reserved person. Now, within Days of Grace, Ashe has a chapter called The Burden of Race. And he begins this chapter by explaining that he didn't write the People magazine article. In fact, it was ghostwritten by a reporter who had come to his Manhattan apartment to interview him. And after the interview was over, Ashe was walking her to her car, being the gentleman that he is. And there's this uncomfortable silence. And she looks at him and says, "Mr. Ashe, I guess this must be the heaviest burden you've ever had to bear, isn't it?" He said, "You're not going to believe this, but being black is the greatest burden I've had to bear." Caught off guard, the shocked reporter said immediately, "You can't mean that." But what Ashe is attempting to do in this particular chapter is not say that he was misquoted, but rather that his statement was misunderstood and misinterpreted. And this ambiguity is evident in his phrasing, that being black is his heaviest burden. Why does Ashe use this phrase? Why doesn't he say racism is his biggest burden? And in this chapter, we see a brief description of Qumran. Now, Qumran was a discovery that came out of Nairobi, and people thought it was a cure for AIDS. It turns out that it wasn't. And so Ashe is talking about the kind of skepticism there and thinking about, well, maybe this is being discredited because it's a major sort of development emerging out of Africa. So we get a discussion of that. We get a 2-page discussion of segregation and his post-celebrity lack of engagement with overt racism once he becomes a tennis superstar. But following the first 10 pages of that, we get 40 pages of Ashe's critique of African Americans. And let me just give you an example of where Ashe goes with the majority of this of this particular chapter. He tells a story that takes place in August 1992, where he's hosting a nationally televised tennis event for the defeat of AIDS. And he and his wife, an African-American woman, and their daughter are sitting in one of the luxury boxes for the tournaments that he's hosting. He invited Stan Smith, also one of the great tennis players of his era, white man from California, his wife, and their young daughter, Austin, 7-year-old Austin. And at this event, Austin had brought 2 white dolls with blonde hair. And of course, Austin and Camara start playing with the dolls, having a good time, young girls, cannon, playing. So then Ashe notices this. He elbows his wife and informs her of what's taking place. So his wife kind of makes the dolls disappear. Then Ashe turns to Marjorie and explains to her what's taking place. And in the chapter, Ashe sort of says that Marjorie was dumbfounded and didn't have a clue as to what was going on. And that's significant because by acknowledging Marjorie's sort of startlement and lack of awareness, Ashe is situating this issue that I'm about to raise as uniquely situated in the African American community.
Is Marjorie Stan Smith's
Yes,
wife?
his wife.
Okay.
Yes, Marjorie is Stan Smith's wife. But since Dr. Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark, both noted African American psychologists, submitted evidence before the Supreme Court in the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case that showed that African American children preference for white dolls was based on an internalization of society's negative stereotypes of African Americans. Black Americans have been sensitive to the need to build up the self-esteem of their children. Now, after taking the dolls away from Camara, Ashe said he felt deeply embarrassed and ashamed because he denied his daughter something she enjoyed because of the possibility that, quote, some black format radio station would be hosting discussions of the event the following week. And Ashe uses this event and others to express his growing frustration with wide segments of the African American community, but also this idea that he had to be a community representative and community spokesperson. Now, I think we got to step back a little bit and look at Ashe's earlier life to see where this sort of philosophy is developed. And I think Stephanie Shaw's work does an excellent example of providing us with the lens into Ashe's generation. Ashe was born in 1953 in segregated Richmond, Virginia. Shaw offers the term socially responsible individualism. And she uses this term to describe the ideas of middle-class Southern families raising their children during segregation. And she argues that the child-rearing strategies were rooted in community considerations and expectations. Appropriate behavior, preparation, hard work, and a sense of community responsibility were the core virtues here. The purpose of this strategy was to encourage high levels of achievement and then link that individual success to community development. For example, Ashe's tennis success would be used to stress the mental capacity, discipline, and civility with which African Americans could conduct themselves. Aware that African Americans would be judged as a race by the actions of a small segment of the black population, African American leaders emphasized that African Americans should be judged by their best and not their worst. Therefore, this strategy suggested that a sense of shared faith and linked consciousness caused African Americans to see that their individual interests were tied to the advancement and progress of the larger black community, and that they possessed responsibility for demonstrating the collective character and ability of the race. Therefore, it was deemed appropriate to see one's individual success as exemplary of the race's potential. Now, as a native of Richmond, Virginia, Ashe was beholden to this tradition because the two most prominent, influential figures in his life were pillars of the black community. His father, Arthur Ashe Sr., was a special police officer on the Richmond police force. He was in charge of 21 playgrounds that served African Americans. As one of the few black men with a city job, with jurisdiction over white citizens as a member of the police force, Ashe Sr. was a highly esteemed member of the black community. As such, Ashe Sr. sought to teach Arthur Jr. the value of education, responsibility, and the importance of maintaining a reputation so, quote, that people could respect Ashe as a human being. Now, in addition to his father, the other great influence in Ashe's life was Dr. Ronald Johnson, who was a medical doctor trained at one of the leading African-American medical schools, Meharry Medical College. And he had established a private practice in Lynchburg, Virginia. Johnson was an avid tennis player and became an influential figure in the American Tennis Association, the African-American counterpart to the United States Lawn Tennis Association. And Dr. Johnson was committed to developing African-American players talented enough to storm the walls of tennis as a means to counteract the racist notion that African Americans did not possess the skills and talent to compete at the elite levels of finesse and gentlemanly sports. By the way, Ashe's mother died when he was 6 years old, so she was no longer around. Now, Dr. Johnson was very particular in how he taught his students. Not only did he teach them the tennis strokes, but also the etiquette and bourgeois values of tennis. On the tennis court, Dr. Johnson taught his proteges that their behavior had to be beyond reproach. No racket throwing, no hollering, and no expression of discontentment with decisions made by officials. In fact, Johnson informed his students that they had to play any ball that was out 2 inches or less, and to give any reasonably close call to their opponents. They also had to pick up all the balls and hand them over to their opponent with a smile. Now, this is very important in terms of understanding Ashe and his sort of political sort of development, because we see both the values he learned through tennis and also the values that he learned in his community when he published his first of 4 autobiographies in 1967, a book called Advantage Ashe. And in this text, he takes a very conservative response to the civil rights movement. Ashe maintained that he, quote, had learned to blend into the background rather than participate in social protest. While he expressed admiration for Dr. King, he was critical of civil rights tactics. Rather than marching and protesting, Ashe asserted that, quote, the best chance for a Negro to advance is to get himself an education, somehow improve his worth as an individual. Parroting the arguments advocated by white conservatives, Ashe concluded that African Americans were trying to ram ourselves down people's throats. We'll never advance far by force because we're outnumbered 10-1. He argued that quiet negotiation and slow infiltration were the most promising measures for African Americans. Now, because Ashe had advanced in the elitist world of tennis with a similar strategy, he believed that this continued to have viability on a national scale. Aware that his thoughts were contradictory to the changing waves in the African American community in the late 1960s, Ashe said, quote, I'm not the crusader type. I pay my $3 yearly dues in the NAACP and I tend to my tennis. He then likened himself to Joe Louis, who once said that, quote, some people do it by shouting, some march, some give lots of money. I do it my way, behavior. Conscious that his perspective led some to saddle him with the derogatory moniker Uncle Tom, Ashe responded, if so, okay. Now, it's not surprising that Ashe would turn to Joe Louis as a model of emulation, given Joe Louis's ability to garner the widespread support of white Americans after African Americans had been barred from fighting for the World Heavyweight Championship for 22 years. Louis was referred to as a credit to his race in the white press because he strove to distance himself from the offensive behavior of the first African American heavyweight champion, Jack Johnson. For Louis and others of his generation, one of the costs of inclusion was that he had to maintain a low profile and avoid controversy. As the only prominent African American tennis star in tennis, Ashe sought to copy and model Louis's political engagement. However, the social positions of African Americans had changed markedly by the time that Ashe became a prominent figure. In fact, if we look at the three major sports, by this time, by 1948, one half of all professional basketball players were African Americans, roughly 1/3 of all football players, and 1/4 of all baseball players were African Americans. So as African Americans became more visible in sports, their mere presence, unlike in Louis's generation and Jackie Robinson's generations, ceased to be seen as a positive progressive racial force. Consequently, their success didn't have the same symbolic meaning. The presence of black athletes increasingly became part of the status quo, the expected, and the taken for granted. Consequently, this silent symbol model of athletic behavior exhibited by Louis and others was now being interpreted by a new generation of athletes as hindering racial advancement rather than promoting it. Now, despite Ashe's sort of reticence about the civil rights tactic, in 1968, we see him becoming much more politically engaged. In fact, he gave his first political speech on March 10th, 1968. Now, I can't say that this was an unequivocal success, but the main thrust of his remarks were that African American athletes had to make a commitment to the black community and work to transform it. Now, there's a conservative undertone to Ashe's description of Jim Brown's organization, the Negro Industrial Economic Union, as a network of do-it-yourselfers. But in the speech, Ashe also went on to say that, quote, there's a lot we can do and we don't do because we're lazy. This may be brutal, but poverty is half laziness. Now, while this bootstraps mentality is grounded in a long tradition of self-help initiatives advocated by African American leaders, Ashe's statements during this speech suggested the structural barriers were no longer overwhelming and that African Americans could succeed no matter what the odds. But even as Ashe became more politically engaged, he was being pushed by others, particularly Stokely Carmichael, who for some reason they kept seeming to run into each other at political events, asked him to become much more politically involved. But I think Ashe still fits within the framework of William Greer's and Price Cobb's notion, the paradigmatic black man. This is a concept that they use in their very influential text called Black Rage. Now, because African American males had to be very conscious about offending white America, particularly during segregation, black men had to, quote, play it cool, be passive, non-assertive, and non-aggressive. Now, the politics of playing it cool meant that African American males had to always present a serene exterior in the face of injustices perpetrated by whites, as was required of Ashe as a tennis player. Southern African Americans were painfully aware that aggression against whites would be cause for swift punishment. Now, a central virtue of this idea of the paradigmatic man was that he was ingratiating and compliant. Thus, for whites, this became the standard by which all African Americans were measured. Now, because Ashe had a reputation for being unflappable and ultra-relaxed, he became, for many whites, the embodiment of the perfect integrated black man. And this image was really crystallized in a very important article in 1968. September 1968, Life magazine ran a cover story of Ashe, and the title of the article was "The Icy Elegance of Author Ashe." Now, this cover story featured Ashe's oft-repeated statement, quote, "What I like most about myself is my demeanor. I seldom get ruffled." Now, describing Ashe's detachment as an important means of identification, they had the ability to heighten Ashe's celebrity. This article has a decidedly political undertone when discussing this icy elegance. Even as Ashe at the same time was trying to assume a more assertive public persona, the press turned his reputation as being mild-mannered into a virtue because of the symbolic importance of his cool demeanor when juxtaposed against the aggressive posturing of Muhammad Ali, John Carlos, Tommie Smith, and other Black Power advocates. More comfortable with the silent and integrationist bent, reporters lionized Ashe's restraint. Reporters continued to express admiration for Ashe and his accommodating perspective. For example, Arthur Daly, who was a leading columnist for the New York Times, celebrated Ashe in contradictory terms when he said that Ashe's militancy is the quiet kind. Many in the press were more comfortable with what publication titled Ashe's Refined Revolution, in which Ashe maintained that, quote, "I don't argue, I don't take stands." Now, Ashe began to reflect on why he was perceived as being so acceptable to many in the white stream and elitist tennis world. And he concluded that his detached approach meant that he was not a threat to these elitist values or to the dominant racial order. Now, as he became a public figure, particularly within the African American community, he believed that many African Americans attacked him because they were more interested in methods rather than objectives. Many Black Power leaders were upset that he was not speaking out strongly against racism in the U.S. and not openly using his tennis success to demand changes in the racist American social structure. Now, however, Ashe, as part of his personality, rejected inflammatory language and aggressive posturing as strategic weapons. Perhaps Ashe was unwilling or unable to acknowledge that a lot of this posturing was tactical and a means to gain attention. Now, for example, Harry Edwards, the 6'8" African-American scholar, former athlete, tells this story in his autobiography. He said that Louis Lomax, a leading African-American journalist, informed him that he needed to create a new image. Lomax told him to replace his traditional tie and suit with clothes that would attract the attention of African-American youth. He told him that his tie and suit, coupled with his Ivy League graduate degree, made the media, students, and the public think that he was just another middle-class Negro with something to say about civil rights. Shortly thereafter, we see a change in Edwards, where he began to wear what I'm calling pseudo-revolutionary clothing. A black cap, work boots, black jeans, African beads, dark sunglasses, and a black jacket, to which he would occasionally pin a box of matches to the front lapel. But this new image drew enormous media attention. Edwards acknowledged that he sometimes had a difficult time keeping a straight face, quote, standing before crowded auditoriums under blazing television lights, delivering a lecture from a race relations class from a rostrum festooned with reporters' microphones, or bombarding white America with rhetoric calculated to outrage. When I couldn't bedazzle them with brilliance, Edward maintained, I bamboozled them with bull. Thereafter, Edwards would frequently incorporate inflammatory language. Uncle Tom, white man's nigger, honky, cracker administrator, throughout his presentation. But Ashe saw these antics as unprincipled, and so clearly rejected. In fact, if you look at Arthur Ashe's work, he takes a very critical perspective, very critical stance on Black power. And for Ashe, he maintained that Black power changed things for the worse in Black America. He said that in 1965, with Black power, African Americans began to turn their back on morality and genuine nonviolence. He fights the movement with discrediting formal education and sees this as its most disastrous result. He wrote, quote, as the idea of a black student learning European history and literature became repulsive in the militant black community, increasingly learning itself became discredited. For far too many blacks to study hard, to aim for good grades, became to act white. Now, I know that's a very politically charged phrase, but much of the recent literature has rejected this notion that for African Americans, academic success is about acting white. But that's not my expertise, so I'm just going to mention that and let you look at it. But notwithstanding Ashe's harsh criticism, Black power ideology was a response to widespread notions regarding the success of the civil rights tactics. After passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, some suggested that these two pieces of legislation eradicated racism from American society. The removal of the legal impediments led many Americans to assert that the market and civil society would fully integrate African Americans in a relatively quick period. Therefore, the legalization of laws, rules, and norms meant that individual African Americans would be able to rise or fall according to their ability and or initiative. However, Black power advocates began to assert that although legal restrictions had been removed, racism remained institutionalized and visibly demonstrated by urban poverty, limited educational opportunities, and restrictive hiring practices, thus hindering the upward mobility of most African Americans. Urban African Americans sought to force American society to shift the battle from recognition and protection of formal equality to a broader critique of the American economic and political system. But Ashe likened Black power advocates to Southern segregationists when he said, quote, I saw a chilling similarity between the segregation that ruled my youth and the proposed new order under Black power. My first 17 years, whites told me what to do. The next 17 years, African Americans were trying to tell me what to do. I rebelled. Now, the high point, now this happens at a very important point when Ashe is trying to become more politically engaged, but also very much in disagreement with Black power politics. So this created a very important quandary. How do you respond to the social imperatives to be more politically engaged, but also maintain your independence from the Black power movement? And for Ashe, the solution was the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. At the time in which Ashe began to engage the anti-apartheid movement in 1969, this was not a major issue in American society. At the time, the South African Open was the sixth highest ranked tournament, and Ashe applied in 1969, 1970, 1971, and 1972 before he was allowed to take part in 1973. But Ashe's engagement in South African apartheid had some interesting kind of consequences, because many in American society, particularly in the press, began to take Ashe's engagement in South African politics to mean that the racial problems in the U.S. had largely been placed under control. And Ashe is being seen and being interpreted as someone who has recognized that this problem has largely been solved, and then thus is moving on to an era where racism and racial subjugation is still an issue. So he's further becoming lionized within much of the white mainstream press because of the way in which they're interpreting his engagement with South African apartheid vis-a-vis the battle within the United States. Now, it's 1975 when Ashe wins, and this is at the height of his engagement with South African apartheid, that he wins Wimbledon, and for the second time is named the number one, or ends the year the number one ranked player in the world. And this is where the title of this talk is derived from. Don't Tell Me How to Think is a defiant title of a provocative article written by Ashe in 1975. By choosing an explicitly African-American publication, Black Sports Magazine, which was a magazine that was started by Brian Gumbel. He was the publisher when it first started, but it only existed for about 5 years in the early 1970s. But by choosing this form to publicly air his frustration, Ashe left no doubt to which audience his thoughts were intended. Described in the press as absolutely unflappable, Ashe was well known, well liked, and well respected for his warm and gentle nature, as well as his conservative commitment to rational rather than emotional responses to sensitive racial issues. But, however, in this Black Sports piece, Ashe starts out, very first sentence, quote, "What I like to know is, how much does a black athlete owe to the so-called community?" An exasperated Ashe asked. Now, by labeling the African-American community so-called, he momentarily questioned the extent to which African-Americans had a common worldview, history of subjugation, and value system. More specifically, he sought to destabilize the long-standing perspective in the African-American community that prominent African-Americans had a responsibility to aggressively fight for the upliftment of all African-Americans. Ashe maintained that, quote, "Primarily I represent me." This phrase, or slight variations, appeared 4 times in this 3-page article. The initial statement was immediately followed by the claim that he secondarily represented anyone who wants to follow. In the same paragraph, after stating once again that his primary allegiance was to himself, he acknowledged, "Well, secondarily, I represent us," referring to the community to which he had earlier called into question. Later, Ashe would assert that he represented himself 60% of the time and African Americans 40% of the time. I don't know how he arrived at that. Nonetheless, he suggests that there were some points of divergence between his individual choices, worldview, and the collective wisdom and belief system of the larger African American community. Now, Ashe is part of a tradition of conservative thinking that has roots within the African American community. While contemporary black neoconservatives deny or minimize slavery, racism, and oppression as vestiges of the past, there is a tradition of black conservatism this does not deny the continuing salience of race as a major issue affecting U.S. culture. Yet traditional black conservatism expresses a profound belief in the ability of the American capitalist democratic system as constituted, for the most part, to help solve problems associated with racial discrimination. Ashe was very clear about where he stood on this issue. He said, I am a black, an American black, but I am a have, and essentially I am a capitalist. This is a strange mixture. Clearly, Ashe is articulating the tension between his racial identity and his upper middle class or rich positioning. However, the unstated dimension here is Ashe's conservatism vis-a-vis the dominant analysis that governed African American political and social ideology in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And in her article, Individual Ethos, a defining characteristic of contemporary black conservatism, Sherry Smith introduces the notion of black conservative individualism. Smith argues that the fundamental values of the individualism espoused by black conservatives are individual reasoning, honesty, and racial transcendence. Individual reasoning is the conservative response to what many black conservatives perceive as flawed group thinking. These conservatives are committed to the notion that it is at the individual level that citizens are best equipped to deal with the challenges they face. Thus, the virtue of individual thinking implies that the notion that the destiny of individual African Americans is tied together is an impediment to the progress of African Americans rather than a positive progressive force. By developing their own individual perspectives on the experiences and thoughts of Black America, conservatives argue that they have reached a level of honesty that is uncommon in African American community. And in this case, when speaking of honesty, they are responding to the perception that African Americans are unable or unwilling to be self-critical, by which Black conservatives are arguing that African Americans aren't taking responsibility for their own particular social situation and their social location. But the primary charge Black conservatives issue is that there has been a weakening of the moral fiber of the Black community, which they argue is the principal reason for the continued struggles that African Americans face. But for them, these ideas of individual reasoning and honesty are crucial for racial transcendence. That is, Black conservatives assert that they have avoided a dominant feature of the collective thinking that they argue pervades African American culture. And that notion is that Black folks' life choices have been limited by racism. Thus, conservatives assert that they have overcome this, quote, victim-focused collective racial identity. Now, continuing with this article, Don't Tell Me How to Think, Ashe asked the question very explicitly, how valid is this debt? After leaving the question initially unanswered, he later provided an honest response that reflected his inner turmoil. Well, what I like to say logically is I don't owe anyone anything. I really don't. But in my own heart, because of my upbringing, I feel I do owe something. Despite his initial hesitancy, he followed his conflicted perspective with a much stronger declaration. Quote, life's been very good to me, so I really think I owe it to my fellow man to do something for him. While this is a much stronger statement, it also lacks racial specificity, for which Ashe has been criticized, given his involvement with Haitian immigration reform, South African politics, and other efforts that he took up. And indeed, Ashe became one of the leading critics of South African apartheid, a position for which he began to face increasing scrutiny within the African American community. Ashe was criticized for not expending his activist energies to combat racism in the U.S. Thus he faced criticism for choosing the wrong causes in trying to pander to white America. All throughout his life, Ashe battled with this question. How valid is the debt? What do I owe? And increasingly, he came to challenge this idea that he had a responsibility to the black community, but also found himself responding to that initiative as well. And it's within that spirit that I think the idea of Ashe's engagement with this question of AIDS and race being a burden is most fruitful, that he's not really talking about racism, but he's talking about this socially mandated responsibility for prominent African Americans to have a social role. And Black History Month, I think that's an important question to raise and something to talk about, and that's why I'm here. And I'd like to thank Cass for inviting me. The Bunche Center, thank you. And I'll take 2 questions. Softballs first.
This is not a question, so I hope I didn't follow.
Oh, go ahead.
I think I heard a slight misstatement that Ashe was born in
1943. 1943. Yes.
Question. So when Ashe won Wimbledon, match point, he gave kind of a understated fist. How do you think he would characterize that?
Oh, he talks about that plenty of times. Ashe won Wimbledon, and if you're unfamiliar with Ashe as a tennis player, Ashe was an aggressive tennis player. Ashe just didn't hit the ball back and forth. Ashe like that line right there. So he's always going for the spectacular shot. But in this particular match, he was facing Jimmy Connors, and at that time, that year, Jimmy Connors won 96% of his matches. He was unbeatable. And as a tennis player, Ashe had a reputation for being a bridesmaid, which meaning that he could advance far in a tournament, but he could never win. But this particular match, he developed a strategy where he was just going to feed Jimmy Connors junk, not playing his normal style of play. And it was this major upset, and many publications have said this is one of the 10 greatest tennis matches of all time. But so Ashe won, and then he gives this fix. Very quick. It's not a prolonged. It's like he looks up, and what he's saying is that he was acknowledging the people who helped him develop this strategy. That it was not a black power fist at all. And based on what I just presented, that seems like a tremendous irony there. But even after Ashe won the Wimbledon, the pressure to become more involved was tremendous. Ashe, you're the number 1 ranked tennis player in the world. Can you come conduct a tennis tournament in Compton? Ashe, can you do this? And Ashe did a lot of that. Ashe did a lot of things. And in fact, I think it is fair to say that Ashe, one of the reasons he never reached his potential as a tennis player was because of all of these other things that he was doing. Being involved in South African apartheid took a tremendous toll on Ashe personally, because what happened is that when Ashe went to South Africa, he faced criticism from all sides. Many South Africans told him, "Why are you here? Go home. You're not helping us." Criticism in the African American community. So a lot of these things had a tremendous impact on him. But yeah, that was not a Black Power solution at all.
Yeah, I was interested in the way that you kind of you did this thing showing Arthur Ashe's problems with the Black Power movement, and you used Harry Edwards as an example of the Black Power movement. And I like the way you showed that it was kind of a bamboozling thing for him. And I'm thinking also how the athletes who he helped to organize for the '68 Olympics later on critiqued him for not even showing to the '68 Olympics. And I was wondering if, first of all, if you use somebody who's more of a representative of the actual political movement to kind of counter what Arthur Ashe has to say about the dishonesty of the movement. And then secondly, like I would just like you to kind of situate your project because you said that your book is on kind of, you know, the situation of, you know, the current situation of black athletes and the kind of, you know, the situation in respect to racism and all that. I was wondering if you could say more about that project. I'm specifically thinking about the ways in which in the media now, the idea of racism is kind of put to the side. It seems like at ESPN, I mean, I was interested in the guy that you raised in that book. He's an ESPN commentator. You said because when I watch ESPN, you would think that racism is only a thing that happened during Jackie Robinson's era. So, and finally, what happened to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf? You know? Chris Jackson, the guy that didn't stand up, like, he disappeared from the face of the earth, and I'm wondering if anybody knows. I thought maybe they
How
just
does that
CIA.
factor into what I'm talking about? No, my Abdul-Rauf was a basketball player, Muslim basketball player, African American who refused to stand up during the national anthem. What was that about? 97, 98. And at the time he went on this campaign, he was averaging like 24, 25 points a game. So an outstanding basketball player. But he's really disappeared off. I don't know what
It doesn't have anything to do with all the rap, I guess.
Yeah.
But I was just really wanting to know if you knew.
But that raises the question about athletes and political engagement and the consequences that they face. And so it is important in the larger scope of what it is that I'm talking about. And I think that's something we've gotta be clear about. The fact that you're making $2-3 million does not mean that you aren't subject to retribution or that you have this kind of freedom from consequences that we often think that athletes have. But certainly there's still the most, well, not the most, but part of the community which we tend to think has a lot more kind of independence based on their wealth. But that may not be true either. I'm trying to do another study which looks at athletes and their financial situation. And it's based off of the lottery. I don't know if you've seen these studies which say that people who win the lottery are in worse financial condition 5 years after they win the lottery than before they won the lottery. And I'm thinking the same is going to be true for a lot of athletes. So while someone may have a $15 million contract, that still doesn't mean that they have financial independence. But the first part was about using someone who has more political. I think that's a good idea. That's a good idea. The reason
do you use anybody else besides him?
not in this particular piece, but there's a new biography on Jim Brown that just came out that's really good and does a great job of detailing a lot of his political engagement. And I think that's probably a better reference point. But the reason why I wanted to use Harry Edwards in that particular example was because it's about presentation and how does one present oneself. And for Ashe, that's very important in terms of, the kind of bourgeois values that he learned in tennis and how he's sort of reading Black power and their kind of imagery. And I thought it was an effective way to kind of do that. And the second part, I may have misspoke about my book. My book is not about contemporary Black athletes, but my degree's in history. So it's really about the geopolitical significance of Black athletes from the integration of Major League Baseball. And I put that in relationship to the Cold War, because it takes place the same year, beginning the issuance of the Truman Doctrine in 47. Jackie Robinson integrates baseball 1 year later. So thinking about how those two incidents are related. And it ends with the 1968 Mexico City Olympic protest, and using that to think about how athletes are trying to begin to recontrol their own symbolism in an international arena after the State Department has tried to receive some kind of political counter for the integration of sports, particularly as nations in Africa and Asia gain their independence and trying to decide, do we align with the U.S. or the Soviet Union, and American race relations became a major international issue. Okay, I saw some hands over here. Yes.
Well, I had a couple of thoughts on the question. One is I hear a lot of Booker T. Washington in Arthur Ashe's remarks, particularly the linking of sort of detachment, ideas about, refined behavior and conservative politics. And that's actually a forced kind of connection. I mean, there are people who are known for being cool, like Malcolm X, for instance, in an interview, who's ice cold in an interview, but then has a very radical kind of perspective. So I was sort of thinking about, the way these two get forged together to kind of construct the idea of, somebody who's not constrained by race, right? But my question actually was more around, sort of thinking about where Ashe was, and was there any kind of dialogue, critique, discussion with he and Muhammad Ali, who, really embraces, the issue of the anti-war movement, embraces all kinds of ideas that are more reflective of the younger generation's kind of critique of Arthur, not even younger generation, but the Black Power activist critique of Ashe.
I try really hard looking for those kind of links, and I can find an Ashe discussion of Ali. I went to that New York Times database. For those of you historians, major moment. The New York Times put all of its back issues on the web, so you can access them digitally. Every article, New York Times from 1950, and I searched that thing thoroughly, looking for those connections, the autobiographies, but I couldn't put them at the same place anytime, or even Ashe offering a sort of critique or analysis of Ali. But the one place I have not looked, and it's such an obvious place, is his three values. That's the one place I know. Did all this stuff, but didn't look at the three values. So I'm gonna go back and take a look at that.
Currently, how would you compare